When we talk about sexual consent, we often boil it down to a simple yes or no. But is that really how it plays out for young people today? In this explainer, we're going to get into the messy, complicated reality of how consent is actually felt, negotiated, and, often misunderstood in the real world.
This quote from a young man in a 2018 study just hits the nail on the head. For so many young people, consent isn't some simple checkbox you tick. It's an ongoing, in-the-moment judgment call. And that leaves us with a huge question, right? How do we actually prepare them to make those calls safely and respectfully? All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to challenge some common assumptions about young people and consent. Then, we'll dive into that huge gap between the legal ideal and their actual lived reality. We'll also see how things like gender and relationship history totally change the game. And finally, we'll look at a new and I think much better model for teaching this vital topic.
You've probably heard this idea before, right? That the problem is young people are just ignorant about sexual consent. But is that actually what's going on? Let's take a look at what the research really tells us.
Okay, so get this. A whopping 89% say they know what sexual consent is. So the problem clearly isn't a basic lack of awareness. Young people have heard the term, they get the general concept.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Even though almost 90% understand the idea, only about a third of them would ever actually use the formal word sexual consent in the heat of the moment. That tells us there's this massive gap between knowing something in theory and actually applying it in real life. So what's really going on here?
To really get to the bottom of that gap, we need to compare two totally different things. The clean, simple idea of consent that we see in the law and in public campaigns, and the messy, complicated reality of how young people actually experience it.
So in the eyes of the law, it's pretty straightforward. It's all about free and capable choice. The whole system is designed to draw a clear line. Did the person have a reasonable belief that consent was given? This is the framework that shapes so much of the public conversation. But, as you can probably guess, real life is rarely that black and white.
And this slide just lays it all out. The legal ideal treats consent almost like a business contract. It's a clear, binary yes or no deal. But the lived reality? That's a whole different story. It's more like a spectrum, with enthusiastic choice on one end and coercion on the other. It's an embodied process, meaning it's felt in your body. It's in the tone of voice, the body language, all of which makes it feel much more like a continuous judgment call than a simple transaction.
Listen to this quote from a young woman. It just sums up that feeling so well. Real life happens in those shades of gray. And that is exactly what makes this stuff so hard to navigate and even just to talk about. It's not an on or off switch.
So, okay, why all the complexity? Where do these shades of gray come from? Well, a massive piece of the puzzle is these powerful, often unspoken social rules we all learn about gender. They're like these gendered scripts that assign us roles and create enormous pressure on both young men and women.
So what do these scripts look like? Well, traditionally, men are pushed into the role of the active initiator, the one who's supposed to pursue sex. Women, on the other hand, are often cast as the passive gatekeepers who are responsible not just for their own desires, but for managing the desires of men. And this whole setup creates completely different sets of expectations and anxieties for everybody.
And just listen to the pressure this puts on women. Here's what one young woman said. She's basically saying that once a man's desire is raised up, it's treated like this unstoppable force of nature. And see what's happening there? The responsibility gets flipped entirely onto women to police their own behavior to avoid leading him on, instead of on men to manage their own actions.
But this is not a one-way street. The pressure on young men is real too. It's just different. This young man is talking about a whole other kind of anxiety, the crippling fear of misreading a situation and being accused of something awful. So his strategy becomes total risk avoidance. If in doubt, just get out. It really shows how both young men and women are trapped by these scripts, just in very different ways.
Okay, and as if that wasn't complicated enough, there's another huge factor: the relationship itself. The way you figure out consent with a brand new partner can be completely different from how it works in a long-term established relationship. The rules of the game totally change.
Yeah, this participant really nails it. When you have a history with someone, the whole dynamic shifts. In a long-term relationship, communication can become this kind of shorthand, you know? That shared understanding can make asking for a super explicit verbal yes feel unnecessary or maybe even a little awkward.
And this dynamic is like a coin with two very different sides. On the positive side, that history and intimacy can lead to this really beautiful, intuitive understanding of each other. But there's a flip side. That same comfort can sometimes slide into a feeling of obligation, where one partner might just end up going with the flow because it feels easier than saying no, even if they aren't really feeling it.
So what are we supposed to do with all of this complexity? Well, if you're an educator, a parent, or really anyone who cares about young people, it's a pretty clear signal. Our old way of teaching consent just isn't cutting it. We need a fundamental shift, moving away from a focus on just avoiding risk and toward one that actually embraces sexual well-being.
Here's the core problem. When education only talks about legal definitions, avoiding assault, and preventing STIs, it's speaking a language that feels completely disconnected from young people's lives. It's all about danger, when what they're trying to navigate is desire, pleasure, and connection.
So what does a better model look like? Well, it breaks down into 3 key shifts. First, we have to acknowledge the complexity. Talk about consent as a continuum, not a simple yes or no. Second, we need to teach nuanced communication, how to read body language, understand context, and see consent as an ongoing conversation. And finally, and this one is so important, we have to start framing sex positively. That means talking about pleasure, intimacy, and mutual respect, not just danger and risk. And that right there is the real paradigm shift we need to make. The goal can't just be about teaching no means no. It has to be about building a culture where an enthusiastic, freely given yes is the absolute bare minimum we expect. The challenge for all of us is to build a new language around sex, one that empowers young people not just to avoid harm, but to actively and confidently seek out healthy, pleasurable, and connected experiences. That's the conversation we need to be having. Everything we've talked about today comes from a 2018 study in the Journal of Youth Studies. If you want to dive deeper and geek out on the original research, we highly recommend you check it out. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.